Hi, I'm Jamie Batts, your instructor for AMP2. We just finished going over the male reproductive system and the hormones involved in the regulation of the male reproductive system. We're going to get into the female reproductive system now. You will see some similarities between the two genders. Let's start with just a quick overview. So, functions of the female reproductive system in males was mostly concerned with reproduction. In females, not only are we producing sex hormones, the gametes for reproduction, just like the males, but we're also protecting and supporting developing embryos, maintaining a growing fetus, and nourishing a newborn. So there's a little bit more to the female reproductive puzzle, so to speak. So let's talk about the gonads. Male gonads are testes, female gonads are ovaries. Ovaries produce oocytes, which mature into ova. These produce hormones. The male testes produce testosterone. The female ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. We'll look at that as we go through. So the female reproductive tract includes sorry, it's really cold. I had to wear my jacket today. The female reproductive tract includes the uterine tubes, which were formerly known as fallopian tubes. So you may have learned them as fallopian tubes. They're now called uterine tubes. They deliver the oocyte or the embryo to the uterus, and these are where fertilization typically occur. We also have the uterus, which is the site of embryonic and fetal development, and the site of exchange between maternal and embryonic or fetal blood. And then you also have the vagina, which is the site of sperm deposition, and the birth canal during delivery also provides a passageway for fluids during menstruation. External genitalia, you have the clitoris, which contains the female erectile tissue, and the labia, which contains special glands to help lubricate and protect, the entrance to the vagina, and then the mammary glands, of course, which produce milk to nourish the newborns. There are all of the ingredients to the female reproductive system: mammary glands, gonads, external genitalia, and the reproductive tract, including the uterine tube, uterus, and vagina. You can pause the video here, go back and review this section. We're going to keep marching forward and talk about the structures of the gonads, the ovaries. So these are paired, just like the testes were paired, almond-shaped, lateral wall of the pelvic cavity, and they have blood vessels that enter at a hilum. So again, most of these organs have a hilum. This is also where the ovary attaches to a structure called the meso-ovarium. Let's talk about the three functions of the ovary. So they are producing the immature female gametes, the oocytes, secreting the female sex hormones, estrogens, and progesterone. And they also secrete inhibin, which should sound familiar because the testes secreted inhibin as well. What did inhibin do in the males? Inhibited FSH secretion. What does inhibin do in the females? Inhibit FSH secretion. Boom, same thing, similarities. So let's talk about how our ovaries are put together. There's a germinal epithelium. This is several layers of cuboidal cells which cover the ovary, and it's continuous with the visceral peritoneum. There's also the tunica albuginea. This is a connective tissue layer that's just deep to that germinal layer. And then the interior portion of the ovary, which has a cortex and medulla, kind of like a lymph node. So here you see the germinal epithelium. The tunica and albuginea is that thicker purple layer. The cortex, which is where all of those bubbles are the developing oocytes, and then the inner medulla, which is where there's lots of blood vessels. You see the meso-ovariums kind of like a little link or ligament holding them in place. The it connects the ovary to the broad ligament, and the uterine tube kind of holding everything together. Those structures, just so you know, the broad ligament and the meso-ovarium are not tubes or passageways, by the way. So, continuing on with female reproductive structures, the uterine tube itself, formerly known as the fallopian tube, is the tube that connects, not physically, but spatially connects the ovary to the uterus. It has an expanded funnel shape section called the infundibulum that opens into the pelvic cavity just next to the ovary. on the other end expands into the uterine cavity. The uterus itself is inferior to the ovaries and is angled slightly anterior and above the bladder. And there's something called the vesicouterine pouch, which is the pocket between the uterus and the bladder wall. We'll see that in a cross section. There's also a rectouterine pouch, which is the pocket between the uterus and the colon. The vagina extends from the base of the uterus, which is the cervix, into the exterior, and then the external genitalia, including the clitoris and the labia. There you see a nice cross section. You can see that the vesicouterine pouch and the rectouterine pouch there, as well as the uterus and its relative position to the bladder, the vagina, the ovary, and the uterine tube. We'll go through some of these parts in just a minute. Let's talk about some of the connective tissues involved, like these ligaments. So you have ligaments to stabilize all of these internal structures. So you have the ovarian ligament, which extends from the uterus to the ovary, the meso-ovarium, which is just a fold of the mesentery supporting and stabilizing the ovary. There's also a suspensory ligament, which extends from the lateral surface of the ovary to the pelvic wall. So it's kind of suspended. Think of like those little gymnasts on the ring. So on one side you have the ovarian ligament, on the other side you have the suspensory ligament. And then the broad ligament attaches to the sides and floor of the pelvic cavity. It encloses the ovaries and the uterine tubes and the uterus itself. It's this big flat sheet that holds it all together. It's kind of like the lamination of the female reproductive tract, right? When you laminate something, it's kind of bound on both sides. That's what the broad ligament does to the female reproductive tract. There it is, kind of holding everything together, that nice big broad ligament. You can see the suspensory ligament as well as the ovarian ligament, that a meso-ovarium between the uterine tube and the ovary itself, a highly vascularized network there. You see the fimbriae on the end of the infundibulum, which is attached to the uterine tube, which deposits into the superior portion of the uterus. And what else do we want to see? Oh, we can see the inferior portion of the uterus here, that opening known as the cervix. The hole is called the external os, and there's an internal os, which is the opening on the inside of the uterus. And then the vagina itself, which has ruggy on it, same thing like our stomach had that ruggy for expansion, obviously during childbirth, but also during intercourse. You can pause the video here, go back and review. Go back and review the section. I was wondering if I should stop, but I think we'll keep going. Let's talk about how eggs are made. It's a process called oogenesis, which is a fun word to say. Say it with me. Oogenesis. You didn't say it, did you? Cheater. The formation and development of the oocyte is the process of oogenesis. It begins before birth, it accelerates at puberty, and it ends at menopause. So what that means is fetal females, before they're born, are making eggs. Kind of crazy. The nuclear events are the same as within spermatogenesis. So you have mitosis and then meiosis occurring, all kind of the same series, but it's just going to happen at different times. So the distribution of cytoplasm is unequal in oogenesis. So instead of creating 4 fairly equal spermatocytes, in the process of oogenesis, the cytoplasm, including all of the organelles and cytosol, are kind of housed in one of the 2 cells that are created. So 1 functional secondary oocyte and 2 or 3 polar bodies are the result of oogenesis. So the polar bodies are pretty much like empty duds of an egg. So they really just have DNA in them. They don't have like mitochondria and ribosomes and ER and Golgi and all those things. So the ovary are going to release that secondary oocyte, not a mature ovum. They release the secondary oocyte during menstruation, and meiosis is not actually complete unless fertilization occurs. It's much different in males than in females. So the overall process begins with mitosis, just like spermatogenesis. In oogenesis, we're starting with an oogonium instead of a spermatogonium. And the plural is oogonia. It's just such a cool word. These are the stem cells. So mitosis is complete before the baby girl is even born. For each oogonium, you're going to produce one new oogonium and one primary oocyte. So just like with sperm formation, you produce another stem cell and then a functional cell. That functional cell in the males was a primary spermatocyte. Here it's a primary oocyte. So meiosis 1 begins between the 3rd and 7th month of fetal development, and those primary oocytes will then begin meiosis 1, but then they are suspended in meiosis 1 until puberty hits, when rising levels of FSH trigger the ovarian cycle. Each month, some of the primary oocytes are stimulated to complete meiosis 1, yielding a secondary oocyte and a polar body. The secondary oocyte gets the majority of the cytoplasm. The polar body gets dissolved and reabsorbed by the ovary. And that secondary oocyte will begin meiosis 2. That first polar body may or may not complete meiosis 2. Like I said, it's typically just reabsorbed. That oocyte then becomes suspended in metaphase 2 when it is ovulated, so when it's released from the ovary. And if fertilization does not occur, meiosis 2 isn't complete. If fertilization does occur, that secondary oocyte will divide into a second polar body, and that is when the egg is finally mature. It is a haploid cell. It has the majority of the cytoplasm from that second cellular division. And here you see all of the process in action. It might make a little bit more sense. So we start with our oogonium or our stem cell. This is all happening inside the ovary, right? In the males, this was happening inside the seminiferous tubules of the testes. Ovaries are a little bit less organized. So oogonium, this is again during fetal development, oogonium divides into a primary oocyte and another oogonium, which can then divide later on. That primary oocyte is going to divide into a secondary oocyte and a polar body. That polar body just pretty much gets reabsorbed. And then that secondary oocyte, once a month during ovulation, will kind of get picked to win the lottery, continue on to meiosis 2 metaphase, and it will be suspended until fertilization occurs. If fertilization occurs, then it will finish its division and produce another polar body and be fertilized. So let's talk about that ovarian cycle. This involves changing those ovarian follicles. Ovarian follicles are specialized structures where the oocyte grow and where meiosis occurs. So in males, this was the seminiferous tubules. You had these nurse cells which were holding everything together for this massive cell production to occur. In females, we have these nice follicles, or like little houses, where these eggs are going to grow and divide. There's about 2 million of these primordial follicles. Primordial follicles are just a little house that has a primary oocyte. There's about 2 million of those when the baby girl is born. Such a weird concept. I look at my 4-year-old, I'm like, you have like, I don't know, you just don't think of 4-year-olds like that. Or at least you shouldn't, right? By puberty, only 400,000 primordial follicles remain. So they slowly degrade themselves. But either way, I mean, who needs 400,000 babies, right? Because each of those follicles is representing a potential life, right? If it's fertilized. They're disintegrated and reabsorbed in a process called atresia. That's just, right, basic reabsorption and kind of willowing away, if you will. Each month, FSH is going to stimulate several follicles to be developed and mature. And this is all part of this ovarian cycle. So let's look at it step by step. That primordial follicle has an egg nest in it. So the primordial follicle is that inactive primary oocyte, and there's a follicular layer of cells around it. There's clusters of these primary oocytes in that outer portion of the ovarian cortex near the tunica albuginea, which is that purple line. So they cluster around each other. The follicular cells will enlarge, they will divide, and they will form several layers around the primary oocyte. So imagine, I always like to come up with metaphors. Imagine that you are the parent of a baby girl, right? I am. And you want to protect her. The baby girl is the primary oocyte in this example, and as you protect her, you build a house around her. That's the primary follicle, but that primary follicle isn't enough. You need to build a moat, you need to plant a forest, and you need to have like a forest of cactuses or something around it, right? You have all of these protective layers around your baby girl to protect her. It's kind of like that. The follicular cells in this case, or the house, is the granulosa cells. This is the inner layer surrounding the cell. You have the zona pellucida, which develops right around the oocyte, and then the thecal cells. This is the layer of cells that form around the follicle. So the thecal cells is that outer cactus forest that's surrounding this whole structure, keeping it all in a nice container so that that primary oocyte slash, your daughter is contained. The thecal cells and granulosa cells actually will produce estrogen. These are the estrogen producing cells. So the secondary follicles can form as the next phase, and this is as that follicle wall thickens, the follicular cells are going to start to secrete fluid. Those fluid-filled pockets expand and they separate and form this inner and outer layer of the follicle. So then we have tertiary follicles. Tertiary follicles are about day 10 or 14 of the cycle. So when the secondary follicle becomes a tertiary follicle or a Graafian follicle, this is a very large follicle. There's an expanded central chamber filled with fluid, and the oocyte is inside of this fluid-filled center. The granulosa cells, again, part of that outer protective layer called the corona radiata, form around this secondary oocyte that's inside of this container. So there's all of these layers of protection. Ovulation occurs when that tertiary follicle releases the secondary oocyte and corona radiata, that inner layer, into the pelvic cavity. This marks what we call the follicular phase, the end of the follicular phase, and the start of the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So the luteal phase begins with the formation of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is basically the empty tertiary follicle. So this secondary oocyte and corona radiata kind of hatched, we're talking about eggs here, right? Hatched out of this tertiary follicle, which had all of these layers to it, hatched out, and now you have this empty shell left behind. That empty shell is the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum contains remaining granulosa cells. They continue to proliferate, and they secrete estrogens and progesterone. The progesterone is fueling the maturation of the uterine lining. So it's fueling that uterine lining to grow, because in theory, that egg was just released, fertilization could occur, and if fertilization occurs, we need a nice soft bed for that embryo to land on. So the corpus albicans is pretty much the that hatched shell, that corpus luteum, shriveling away and becoming like a little piece of scar tissue that is left behind as kind of the echo of ovulation. It's there. It marks the very end of the ovarian cycle, and it's called the corpus albicans. Here it all is in a nutshell. What the heck was Jamie just talking about? Let's break it down. You have your primordial follicles. They're living in an egg nest or this small cluster, right? That's happening in, the fetal baby girl, right? Those are all ready to go. Then they're going to form primary follicles. The primary follicle still has that primary oocyte inside of it, but it has several layers of protection around it, right? That's that house in the forest, think of. Then you have the secondary follicles. The secondary follicles are now where we have the zona pellucida and an expanded area in the middle where the primary oocyte lives. So you have the granulosa cells, but you also have this zona pellucida, this extra layer around our secondary oocyte. Our tertiary follicle is made when we have this fluid-filled antrum and the corona radiata. So that zona pellucida basically will translate into the corona radiata. It will be surrounded by lots of follicular fluid for protection. That secondary oocyte is still inside. Then ovulation occurs. At ovulation, we're leaving behind our outer shell, so to speak, and erupting out of the ovary, and the corona radiata and secondary oocyte are released into the uterine tube. The corpus luteum remains and secretes the progesterone and estrogen, and then shrivels away and forms a little piece of scar tissue we call the corpus albicans. Boom! Uterine or ovarian cycle. And I'm going to stop this here so you can go back and review and re-listen if you need to. There's a lot of hormones, a lot of different things going on. So it's super important that you understand all of those nitty-gritty details. Have a good day. Bye.